Chimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, or would harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Chimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Chimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Last week, we discussed the second Mesozoic dynasty. Though its prelude was 7 million years of ice ages, it stabilized 145 million years ago and ushered in the first age of dinosaurs. For 30 million years, sauropods were extremely abundant, the dominant megafauna. Allosaurs hunted these giants with a host of ceratosaurs and megalosaurs as their ecological henchmen, and a range of stegosaurs, ornithopods, and ankylosaurs, rounding out the ranks of tropical megafauna cast grazing and browsing throughout lush forests and floodplains. The survivors of the Ice Ages were relegated to the temperate zones in north and south, though they evolved their own cast of diverse and distinct flora and fauna. Following a still debated catalyst, the 30 million years without harvest came to an end, and several harvests of the Aptian and Albian introduced plants and animals from the end of Earth's early Cretaceous period to Chimere. Perhaps due to advantages of these new plants, there was a fairly quick replacement of the Brachiosaurus chimerosaurs and diplodocoids with a new sauropod. The first titanosaurs. In broad strokes, this wasn't much of a change. Sauropods were still the dominant large herbivores, and the top predators were still carnosaurs from a newly harvested Carcharodontosaur. There were still ankylosaurs and ornithopods, though they were also generally of the newer clades. Stegosaurs appear to have been their strongest holdout of the second Jurassic dynasty, perhaps because cycads were still in great abundance, and by now the surviving members of the clade were specialized. The titanosaurs, which took over for the four clades which defined the previous dynasty, appear to have done so with such great success because they were generalists. The prior four clades coexisted by careful partition of diet and habitat. There were other sauropods in this old dynasty and new, but an estimated 90% of sauropods, at least in terms of population estimates during this dynasty, were titanosaurs. They weren't as good at processing hard food as chimerosaurs, as able to reach the highest branches as brachiosaurs, able to cover as much of a range in browsing as diplodocoids, or as excellent at low browsing fern grazers as the rebbachisaurids, but they were second best in all fields. This proved a winning strategy. They quickly spread throughout Nicar and Cairul. Elasmarians also took to the scene and thrived, especially in the southern range of Nicar and Cairul. They were small and versatile, being the most abundant dinosaurs of the south. As the new herbivores were generally more successful, so were the predators already specialized in them. Though the giant allosaurs like Pteropararexus continued to be present for a few million years, the Carcharodontosaurs gained a lot of ground quite fast. Carcs like Tyranotitan are presumed to be ancestral to this initial clade, which became dominant predators. By the time of this dynasty's pinnacle, 95 million years ago, the Carcharodontosaur genus Titanocardinalis and its relatives were the undisputed apex predators, which species throughout Cairul and Nicar, both in the tropics and the temperate zones. The cardinals were a long-lived and slow-growing animals, and their juveniles seem to have held mesopredatory niches for over a decade, not unlike what was seen in tyrannosaurs of Earth and megaraptorans of modern Chimere. This dynasty spanned 25 million years. The first cardinals evolved around 5 million years into the dynasty, and this genus is debatably found throughout the rest of the dynasty. lasting unchecked and largely unchanged for the better part of 20 million years, makes Titanocardialis among the longest-lasting apex predators of Chimere. It must be said that there are several recognized species, and it would not be a surprise if the true diversity was greater, and therefore more genera would be erected as they were seen if they were living species. But the assembly generally recognized so little variation in skeletal material found in both Kyrule and Nikar, and the cardinal's reign truly does seem to be consistent. They might technically be different genera, forming a clade of their own, but in broad strokes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Though they had a massive influence over the ecosystem, the cardinals were not the only predators. This was also the heyday of Coelurosaurs. While there were ceratosaurs, allosaurs, and megalosaurs confirmed throughout the dynasty based on albeit fragmentary remains, it was the Coelurosaurs which were by far the most abundant, small, and mid-range theropods under the rule of the cardinals. Dromaeosaurs began what may be the longest tenure of any clade in the niche of dominant mid-sized carnivore. Indeed, most adult theropods between 20 and 100 kilograms were dromies. The origin of these dromaeosaurs is disputed. Many of the Cretaceous fauna accounted for in this dynasty are of Gondwanan origin. In light of this, the dromaeosaurs of this era are likely Unenlagines. However, a common family seems to be similar to Deinonychus. Perhaps they independently evolved similar anatomy specialized for macropredation. It's possible we simply haven't found relatives of Deinonychus in Gondwana, or maybe the Laurasian harvest at the time wasn't as impactful. At present, it remains a mystery. The size class above them, being between 1 and 300 kilograms as adults, was generally dominated by the basal clade of Coelurosaurs. Where exactly these predators fit on the theropod family tree remains debated by paleontologists of both Earth and the Assembly. They may have been early relatives of tyrannosaurs, perhaps early tyrannosaurs themselves. Comparisons have been drawn between them and the best preserved specimens of Eotyrannus. Perhaps it was a yet more primitive clade, as some of the markers may be convergent or parallel. Regardless, it is generally accepted that these were the first Megaraptorans. Not the Megaraptorids we see in our own fossil records, such as Maip, Aerostion, and Australovenator, but similar to the ancestor of these taxa. As these animals are generally thought to be ancestors of Zentaur and Uctan, should these presumed basal Megaraptorans turn out to be a distinct clade of basal Coelurosaurs or Tyrannosaurids, this might render the description of the apex theropods of Chimere as no longer technically Megaraptorans. Regardless of phylogeny, they were very similar to early Megaraptorans and Tyrannosaurs. They were very fast and agile by necessity. Much of their prey would have been small, which demands incredible reflexes, and the young cardinals, sharing their weight class, would have been much more powerful pound for pound, so they had to keep on high alert. Because of this position, large enough that they couldn't always hide or flee, yet small enough that they couldn't confidently rest, seems to have primed them with a formidable suite of senses, reflexes, and weaponry, which would prepare them well for their own time in the sun 100 million years later. Like the dromaeosaurs, the origin of these Coelurosaurs, Megaraptoran or otherwise, is debated. Basal Megaraptorans and their presumed kin are known from the time from Laurasia, but future finds or reviews of known material may illuminate Gondwanan relatives. Basal Oviraptorosaurs, Therizinosaurs, and Ornithomimosaurs were also among the harvested which are found throughout the tropics at this time, lending credence to the idea of a Laurasian harvest. There were enough wetlands that the Spinosaurs harvested at this time thrived. Their largest member, Therizixthes, was increasingly large and successful in the later years of the dynasty as the climate became warmer and wetter. Especially along the eastern coast of Nikar, which was a slow-flowing wetland, they were extremely abundant, getting enormous on a diet of diverse large fish. Armored dinosaurs of the Acrosaur clade continued to prosper. There were parankylosaurs found at this time, and they seem to have done best in the south, where the resident armored dinosaurs were not as abundant. By this time, the acrosaurs had a full carapace of armor around their torsos. Heavily fortified, but would not be as mobile as the new ankylosaurs now dominant in the south, and having a higher level of activity has been proposed to benefit the newcomers in this more temperate context. As the planet got warmer, the parasauropods and coelophosaurs, which had enjoyed comfortable dominion over the cold temperate zones, suddenly found a spike in competition. To the north, they were saved by a portion of Kyrule breaking off prior to the arrival of much of this competition, though the rest of the north was taken over by the Cardinals. To the south, salvation came not from part of a continent breaking away, but land coming toward them. Arvel had arrived. In modern Chimere, Arvel is on a trajectory to crash into Nikar. It has technically already done so, and for quite some time, as the Trachayam Sea is a continental plate mostly stemming from Nikar. The inland sea is expected to subduct under Arvel within the next 20 million years or so. However, back during the Cretaceous, Arvel was part of a supercontinent encompassing what is now Kaishel, Picardia, and the southern islands. This continent was still mostly polar, but part of it was quite far north, reaching into the temperate zone. This portion was Arvel, and it was in the process of breaking free. Though it would not entirely break free of the southern continent until 80 million years ago, but 115 million years ago, what is now Western Arvel was connected by a short land bridge to both peninsulas of southern Kyrule. This land bridge was prelude to a great biotic interchange. Up until that time, the southern continent was home not to dinosaurs, but a host of entire tetrapod classes endemic to Chimere. Heterotherms were the top predators here. Their nominative dynamic metabolism allowed for activity based on available prey. When times are good and they are very active, but in times of famine they can conserve energy in torpor. Phabodonts were the most successful large herbivores, using a formidable battery of teeth to process a wide range of vegetation. While some of these southern clades were successful in the northern mainland, they had a lot of cold adaptations. Increasingly warm temperatures in the global climate meant that there was not much incentive for them to venture north. The story was inverted for the temperate theropods and parasauropods. They were struggling in the warming native land, and suddenly a whole new continent of much more comfortable temperatures became available to them. Though paleontological surveys of Kaishel are not easy, much of southern Arvel has been examined, and it seems dinosaurs had quite rapid success spreading through Arvel and into the rest of the northern supercontinent. Elasmarians, dromaeosaurs, and megaraptorans of the new dynasty made a name for themselves, and a lineage of titanosaurs was present, if restricted to the northern, warmer part of Arvel. But it was the parasauropods and coelophosaurs which were the most successful of the new dinosaurs taking over Kaishel. A large coelophosaur called Cryotoratus became apex predator of this supercontinent quite quickly, preying on a range of dinosaurs and phabodonts. This land bridge would only be present for as brief as 5 million years early in the dynasty, before the southern continent continued its clockwise rotation. Despite a fairly comprehensive turnover of terrestrial fauna, the rulers of sea and sky generally remained from dynasties past. The crocodile archosaurs from the form of Thalattosaucians were now fairly rare outside of Kyrule's then entirely narrow inland sea. While ichthyosaurs were in decline on Earth, this was their golden age in the oceans of Chimere. The top predator of the waters near the portal was a large ichthyosaur called Prorostrum, with teeth specialized to grip and tear flesh. Plesiosaurs were still abundant, and pliosaurs also successful. Many new fish and sharks had been introduced, but a lot of native marine fauna persisted as well. Overall, this was a thriving era of ocean life, especially as a portion of Arvel directed currents to bring high-nutrient water from the polar seas up to the tropics. As mentioned previously, the skies also generally favored the old guard. The pterodactyloid pterosaurs were present. It was the Rhamphorhynchids who were the undisputed kings of the sky. They converged on some pterosaurs common on Earth at the time, such as adapting the patagia of the legs to make terrestrial locomotion more efficient at their greater size. Largest was the genus Caesarsdrachen, which, while shorter than the Asdarchids of late Cretaceous Earth, was superior in overall size, rivaling the Titan crow of modern Chimere for largest pterosaur to ever evolve. Some clades reduced their tails to minimize drag, but it appears these sexually selective pressures favored the long tails, and some, like Caesarsdrachen, kept them. While some filter feeders fed on aeroplankton, it seems this was not as productive a niche as it was in the Dynasty past. They persisted, so there was some sky plankton that had been present, but it was not abundant. However, the fundamental adaptations of these filter feeders of the sky translated smoothly to such habitats in the water, and an aquatic lineage became especially massive, best represented by Atrocinias, which could stand 3 meters tall and had a beak which could reasonably be mistaken for belonging to a small baleen whale at first glance. As they are wont to do, the continents continued to drift. Around 85 million years ago, the southern continent truly began to break apart. Arvel wouldn't break off for another 5 million years, but the continent was churning out a lot of volcanism. It is not known if this caused the end of the dynasty, but like the transition between 2nd and 3rd, the marker between 3rd and 4th Mesozoic dynasties is tenuous. Ultimately, it really just was the beginning of a spike in harvests. Indeed, some consider the subject of next week's episode to be too brief to constitute a dynasty, as there were harvests throughout the Campanian and Maastrichtian, and lack the general stability marking a dynasty. If there is a technical era of a dynasty and it didn't last more than 7 million years, however, it's still an era worth covering and will be the subject of next week's episode. Thanks to Garrick for sponsoring this episode, cheers to my Patreon patrons for your support, and thank you so much for watching. Cheers, folks!